So, good day, everyone. And it's a pleasure for me on behalf of Elizabeth Maremma, the Executive Secretary, and all my colleagues here at the CBD Secretariat to welcome you to this webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Today we'll hear an update from members of the scientific community on a recent analysis of the interlinkages across the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the draft framework. This webinar is part of a series of webinars which are taking place in the lead up to the resumed sessions of the Working Group on the Post-2020 Framework, SBI, and SBSTA, the Convention subsidiary bodies. These meetings were mentioned, as mentioned in the recent notification. These resumed meetings will now take place in March 13th to the 29th of March in Geneva, and we're happy to say that we're confident we can go ahead with these meetings. The complete set of the series of the webinars which are being carried out can be found on the web link, which I hope you can see on the screen. But this webinar is actually a little bit different from the others in that it's been led by the scientific community. It's presenting an independent analysis led by some 50 scientists from around the world, convened through Biodiscovery and GeoBon. The analysis being presented is also available in the form of an information note for the working group and for SBSTA. That's INF 11 for the working group, INF 31 for SBSTA. And as I mentioned, the paper represents the independent views of the scientists involved. But under the convention, and since the convention's establishment, of course, the importance of science for decision making has been well recognized by parties. And that's why the convention has its dedicated body, the SBSTA, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice. And we're very pleased to have Ezequiel Benitez, the SBSTA chair, with us this morning, and he'll make a few remarks shortly. The process for developing the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including the current first draft, of course, has had an assessment of the science and of scientific information at its core, the IPBES Global Assessment and the Convention's Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, as well as other recent reports such as the IPBES IPCC report on climate change and biodiversity. They've all provided an important basis for the development of the post-2020 framework. And of course, they all have similar messages in terms of the need for urgent action on biodiversity, the importance of addressing climate change and biodiversity together, and the importance of looking at all of the drivers of biodiversity loss. They also underline the need for transformative change in order to tackle the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. We think that this report that's been presented today, and you may incidentally have seen reports of it also in the media last week, should help to fill a gap in terms of the available science, providing an analysis of the linkages between the various proposed goals and targets of the framework, and looking at specific scenarios on how those goals and targets can be reached. I don't want to take up more time, as I'd like to make sure that we have as much time as possible first to hear from our speakers and then to have some questions and answers and discussion. So again, welcome to this webinar. I'm now pleased to hand over to Ezequiel for his opening remarks. Over to you, Ezequiel.
Thank you very much, David. Welcome, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm pleased to be invited to give some opening remarks to this webinar organized by GeoBond, Biodiscovery, and CBD Secretariat. At part 1 of the 24th meeting of SUBSTA, we initiate a scientific and technical review of the goals and targets of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework on the basis of document 24.3 up to Rep 1, which include a scientific review of the goals and targets. We also discuss the monitoring framework under this same agenda item, and I would like to mention that there are linkages between the scientific information and the monitoring framework. In particular, the science builds the case for the importance of high quality and timely monitoring. So I take the opportunity to encourage all of you to join the webinar on next Thursday, which will specifically be discussing the monitoring framework. During SUBSTA, a contact group was established to review the scientific and technical review of goals and targets in the updated zero draft of the Post-2020 framework. I would like to remind participants of some of the discussions that from that contact group, which are relevant for the discussion today. A few of the items that were brought up by some parties were the need for tangible goals, the importance of linking the goals, targets, and the monitoring framework in order to streamline the framework, possible improved alignment with the transitions in the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the importance of defining the ambition of the framework and ensuring that the ambition is supported by sufficient scientific and technical information. How the ambition of the goals and targets relate to national action or targets to the available scientific information and planetary boundaries. The need for all 3 levels of biodiversity, genetic, species, and ecosystems, as well as objectives on sustainable use and access and benefit sharing, not only conservation, to be reflected in the Post-2020 framework. Capturing of direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, for example, climate change, and those identified by the IPBES in the framework. And finally, I would like to mention that this discussion highlighted that the Post-2020 framework needs to be rooted on science. At the time of part 1 of SUBSTA, there will be some gaps, still some gaps in terms of the science available, and parties note the need for scientific advice that could be used to inform the deliberation on the Post-2020 framework, including quantitative elements of goals and targets and the monitoring framework. I believe that the information paper being discussed today, convened by Biodiscovery Program of Future Earth and the Secretariat of the Group of Earth Observation Systems, Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network on GeoBond, to provide an updated scientific synthesis and assessment based on the first draft of the Post-2020 framework will be particularly available for parties to read in preparation for such a discussion. I will hand over in a minute for representatives of this paper to present the findings, but from my perspective, I would like to share a few thoughts. Firstly, the need for ambition, goals, and targets, setting and action, and for transformative change is clear. This is important as we go to Geneva, as parties need to remember that without a strong GBF, which is based on science, there will be irreversible consequences. Secondly, ensuring a clear link between the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and national target setting and implementation is essential. This is a key message not only for the post-2020, but also for both for SBSTA and the SBI, which will be considering monitoring, capacity building, technology, implementation, review, financing, and other related issues. And thirdly, the goals and targets are highly interlinked, and thus the framework cannot be seen or negotiated as a series of silos. All this is connected. Our planet is connected. We are connected. I hope that this webinar is useful for you all, in particular for parties and observers participating at the Geneva meetings next March. And now I would like to invite representatives of GeoBond and Biodiscovery to present the findings of these papers. Thank you very much and good luck.
Okay, are we up with the slides? Yes. Hi everybody, good time of the day wherever you are. Thank you so much to David Cooper and Hezekiah Benitez for their introductory words, and to the Secretariat of the CBD for helping in organizing this event. I'm Alexander Rankovic. I'm a lecturer at the Paris Institute for Political Studies and one of the happy organizers and authors of this report. And so here you have the title, the transformative actions on all drivers of biodiversity loss are urgently required to achieve the global goals by 2050. And this is the report that we will be presenting to you today. Next slide, please. So while this report is the result of the collective effort and work of more than 50 authors, today you'll mostly hear from people on these slides who are composing the organizing committee of this work. So I'll just briefly say their names, and you will see most of them appear in front of you soon. So on the side of Biodiscovery, you will be hearing from Paul Lidley, Cornelia Kruglin, Shannon, David Obura, and on the side of GeoBond in the organizing committee, we had Andrew Gonzalez, Maria Cecilia Londonio Murcia, Adriana Radulovici, and Katie Millet. Next slide, please. So before we present and discuss the substance of the report, I would just like to say a few words on the genesis and how we work together. Basically, this work stemmed from two observations over the last year. In last May, June 2020, during the first part of SBSTA 24, we heard and observed, and as was recalled, that there was a need for additional scientific advice on several aspects of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. For example, about the linkages between the 2030 action targets and 2050 goals. One issue is that, and the second observation, is that because of the pandemic, we are now almost 3 years after the release of the IPBES global assessment, and thus the second observation is that there's also an important need to provide us a synthesis of the latest scientific publications and made them available for discussion to the actors involved in the post-2020 process. One problem was that given the procedural constraints to produce an IPBES assessment, it was impractical to organize a rapid assessment by IPBES in the time that was available. And so between September and December 2021, the scientific community proactively organized itself through the secretariats of Biodiscovery and Future Earth and GeoBon, and proactively organized to synthesize the latest available scientific knowledge on the level and type of ambition that is necessary to achieve the global biodiversity goals in 2050. Next slide, please. And so how we worked, the organizing committee invited scientific experts that were working on different realms and dimensions of biodiversity, and that were also from the most diverse geographical background. In total, there were 52 contributors from 23 countries, and the selection focused, but was not limited to, focused on experts that were involved in GeoBon, Biodiscovery, or IPBES. The collective work was iterative. There were initial themes that were proposed by the organizing committee, and during first a series of online workshops, the first taking place in November. Then through this collective work, the themes were refined, subgroups were formed to synthesize different aspects of the literature. And we also invited 4 external experts to review the document on advanced drafts. Next slide, please. When informed of this work, the Secretariat of the CBD kindly agreed to publish the report as an INF document, and would like to thank them again for this. And also, both the Secretariat and the Post2020 co-chairs provided feedback on the clarity and consistency of the text, and we take the opportunity to thank again the CBD Secretariat and the co-chairs for their remarks. Next slide, please. And so briefly, we had 3 main objectives for the report. The first was to show how the 21 action targets were related to outcomes for biodiversity that were set out in the goals and milestones of the Global Biodiversity Framework. While we all the team really recognized the importance of all of the goals because of the time constraint that we have, the focus of the report is only on goal A and its milestones, so don't be surprised when you will be hearing the presentations. The other objective was to synthesize the evidence base that we thought was necessary to discuss, and what's the ambition that is needed to address the drivers of biodiversity loss in order to meet both the 2030 milestones and the 2050 goals. And lastly, also to show the importance of using indicators that enable to track progress towards goals and targets, but also enable to have an analysis and attribution of biodiversity change to drivers, and that can also inform strategic planning of actions needed to achieve the GBF outcomes. Next slide, please. And last point from me is just to tell you that the framework of the report is really rooted in the conceptual framework of IPBES, and with a focus on both the direct and indirect drivers and their impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. And here on this graph, you can see a mapping of the different goals of the GBF and the targets in the conceptual framework of IPBES. And that being said, I will hand the floor to David. And David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all on the line. It's a privilege to be here to present 2 of our 8 main findings on behalf of our authors group. So thank you. Now, our first finding is to state explicitly that there is no one-to-one linkage from any action target to a given milestone or goal. Instead, many-to-many relationships exist among them. We present in the report this integrative figure. It's designed to help explain and show the relationships among targets, milestones, and goals, and potentially assists in country and smaller scale analysis of drivers, actions, and potential outcomes for biodiversity, and how these line up under targets and milestones. Constructing this illustration was motivated by the discourse that has been ongoing under the discussions of the GBF as outlined in the opening presentations. We selected to use a flow diagram such as this because it has two key attributes. The first is that it shows which elements contribute directly to other elements in the diagram, in this case, cause-effect relationships from left to right, and that's the connecting lines. Secondly, it shows the quantity or proportionate contribution relative to other elements, and that is in relation to the thickness of the lines. As explained just now by Alex, we focused on goal A. We were not able to incorporate goal B and C because of time and expertise constraints, but also the complications become very difficult to illustrate effectively in this diagram. We didn't have sufficient time to work out these challenges. But that could be done in more focused analyses afterwards. The importance of the three milestones under goal A and their contribution to the goal are clear. We settled in the end, after many iterations, on illustrating 10 targets, targets 1 to 10 that relate to direct drivers identified under the IPBES framework. And then to the left of these, the indirect drivers in the tools and solutions section of the Global Biodiversity Framework from target 14 upwards, and including a component of target 1, we illustrate to the left. And the key thing about this diagram is that the elements to the left are presented as prerequisites for achievement of elements to the right. Next slide, please. In this slide, we illustrate the build-up in a simplified flow diagram, emphasizing the importance of the linkages and their thicknesses. Here showing first the three milestones and goal A. If you can click once, please. We then show how for two selected targets under the direct action targets. So here target 3 on protected and conserved areas and target 4 on species conservation actions. And the thickness of the lines to the milestones indicating the weight of the importance of those targets for each of those milestones. And then for some of the tools and solutions or indirect drivers further to left, and here we illustrate using target 18 on harmful subsidies, target 21 on participation, but they link to the implementation of the direct action targets, so targets 3 and 4 in this case, rather than directly to the milestones or the outcomes for biodiversity themselves. And so this really indicates that the sequencing that's necessary, the various other targets under the framework can be lined up under those. And a key question we address is what is the relative importance of each of these cause-effect relationships? So next slide, please. This brings us to the second finding that I'll report, which is in fact finding 3 under our INFDOC. And this is that all 5 of the principal direct drivers of biodiversity loss, land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species, all of these have substantial impacts on all dimensions of biodiversity. This illustration from the IPBES global report show how the IPBES authors partitioned the impact of these drivers across 6 components of biodiversity. I won't go into the full methodology because it's in Appendix 1.1. If you click once again, please, we can see how we aggregated these 6 components of biodiversity into the 3 that relate to milestones A1, A2, and A3. We also aligned the targets 1 to 10 to these direct drivers, some of them being one-to-one relationships, others being more complex, as shown there, and that these numbers in the table are incorporated in the thickness of the lines in the flow diagram to the right. And then if you click once again, when you look at this figure from the perspective of the milestones, you can see how the importance of the direct targets adds up. You can click once, please, to move to the next slide. Thank you. So, oops, so sorry, we went one too far. I think there's a delay on my side. If we can go back one slide, we can see how for milestone A1, the contribution, thank you, of all of the 10 direct driver targets, and their proportionate contribution to meeting milestone A1. sorry, it is jumping around. We need to see the column graph in the next slide that I can see. And so what this shows is that for meeting milestone A1, all of the direct drivers contribute a portion, or addressing them through the targets contribute a portion to meeting A1, but none contributes more than about 15%. And so it emphasizes the importance of meeting all of them. If we then go to the next slide, we give in the document some concrete examples about avoiding extinction risk of birds and mammals, and then we also give examples for ecosystem impacts for coral reefs and the Amazonian rainforest. In this case, we show that for avoiding extinction in 32 species of birds, the literature shows that a wide range of actions are necessary. Here, across different areas of interventions, from area protection and management, control of invasive alien species, species-based management, and so on. But there's about 4 to 6 key action areas that have about equal weight, dominant weight in avoiding extinction in birds. So emphasizing that we need to address all the direct drivers in meeting conservation goals, not trying to cherry pick one or another. Next slide, please. And then, so we have dealt with the contribution of the direct drivers to achieving the milestones. And if you click once, please, the next component to address, which will be presented by Paul Ledley, is how the indirect drivers contribute to meeting the direct drivers. But IPBES global assessment didn't attempt to quantify the impact of the indirect drivers because of the complexity of doing that. So we show these non-specific many-to-many interactions. And then below that, the timeframes that are needed in terms of addressing indirect drivers at the beginning in order to meet direct drivers and achieve biodiversity outcomes. And with that, I'll pass over to Paul Ledley in the next slide, please.
All right, thank you very much, David. And so as David said, we also want to look at indirect drivers. And in the second finding of the executive summary, we looked at different scenarios of changes in indirect drivers and came to the conclusion that transformative change is essential if we want to meet ambitious milestones and goals for biodiversity. So transformative change is this idea that really came to the forefront in the IPBES global assessment. And essentially what this means is that we need quick, sweeping changes in all of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. And this includes things like rapid changes towards sustainable production and consumption, especially in food systems, really deep cuts in subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity, mainstreaming of biodiversity in public, in governments, and in business, and so forth. And when you look at that specifically in terms of the global biodiversity framework, what that means is that we need high ambition, not just on the direct drivers, but we need high ambition across targets 9 through 21, and if at all possible, with quantitative objectives for those. So what we've done to look at these indirect drivers is to take a look at recent trends in indirect and direct drivers and their impacts on biodiversity, primarily drawing on the IPBES global assessment, the GBO5, and recent publications. And then we've also done a new synthesis of very recent publications of global sustainability scenarios that explicitly address biodiversity and are directly pertinent for the global biodiversity framework. Next slide, please. And so what we've done is we've distilled all of that information about past recent trends and all these different scenarios into 3 categories of scenarios or scenario types. And this table here shows these 3 scenario types that we call continued trends, one focusing on more traditional conservation and restoration, and another one really that's covering these broad systemic changes in society that we call a transformative change. And then we show how these are related to achievement of the different targets. And so if the box in the table is green, that means that those targets are achieved. If it's yellow, there's some progress, but modest progress towards achieving those targets. And if it's pink or reddish, then there's not much progress or little progress towards achieving those targets. And so what we've done is in the continued trends, what you're seeing is that we've made the assumption that there's a very good job in getting to very ambitious area parts of the protected area target. But as in the past, much less progress in getting towards effective and representative protected areas with a great deal of heterogeneity. That there's some progress in restoration and species management programs, but it's modest progress. And in particular, there's weak progress or no progress across a number of the indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So for example, there was no progress made in harmful subsidies from the period 2010 to 2020, and the assumption of continued trends is that that would continue that way. So that's the first scenario type. The second scenario type assumes that conservation and restoration are done really, really well. So you're protecting large areas, they're effective, they're representative, they're well-resourced, they're well-managed. You're doing widespread restorations, well-funded species management programs are in place, but you still haven't made these deep systemic changes in society, and that's why this pink box for sustainable use implementation and mainstreaming is still pink. And then in the last scenario type, we're making the assumption, or the scenarios have made the assumption, that you do transformative change. You really make big progress on these more systemic parts of society. Next slide, please. So then we can, what the outcome is for biodiversity when we look at these different scenarios based on these different assumptions. So in the continued trends, essentially what we do is we see continued trends in terms of biodiversity loss across all dimensions of biodiversity. All of the, if you look at this table now, in that column of continued trends, all of the boxes or almost all of the boxes are pink or reddish, meaning there's very little progress. We're still losing biodiversity high rates. What's really important is if in these scenarios, it seems very plausible if we do conservation and restoration very well, we can actually slow down the loss of biodiversity, especially in natural ecosystems. But what they do show is it makes it very difficult to halt, and it certainly get onto a pathway of bending the curve of biodiversity, so restoring biodiversity. And in transformative change scenarios, it does seem plausible that we can not only just slow down biodiversity loss, but actually halt it and get on a pathway to reversing biodiversity loss by 2050. And that's where you see in transformative change that for all these dimensions of biodiversity, all of the boxes are green. So the message, the take-home message for the global biodiversity framework is that conservation and restoration measures clearly have a lot of momentum, and they're critically important for attaining ambitious goals, milestones and goals for biodiversity. But you can't bend the curve, you can't get to a really nature positive future without making fundamental and systemic changes in society that correspond to transformative change. So thank you for that. And I hand this now over to Katie Millett, who will be talking about the next main messages.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so our next messages are about how successful the implementation of the framework can be. So our main finding here, we find that the implementation of the framework at the international, national, and local levels will be a primary determinant of the framework's success. Drivers of biodiversity loss operate at and across several spatial scales to affect biodiversity. So the numerical targets defined at the national levels, they are key, but we shouldn't also forget that the local level is very important as well. Because of this, in our finding, we show that there will be need for some flexibility in the framework to adapt to the implementations of the targets. And what we mean by this flexibility is that the flexibility in the quantitative values, they should allow for the integration of data and new information that we're gathering through assessments of biodiversity and drivers at all spatial scales. There's also a need to assess how actions conducted at the local national, regional, and sub-regional levels are contributing to the achievement of the global targets and goals. And what's really important for this is that we have to ensure that there is a regular evaluation that is being conducted of the actions and the outcomes that are resulting from these actions that we are taking. So the results should be shared among parties and other stakeholders. We should be analyzing what is the outcome when we do implement an action. If it works, iterate it and possibly adapt it for other actors where appropriate. Next slide, please. The next finding is that reversing biodiversity loss will require addressing threats to biodiversity in both natural and managed ecosystems and the interconnections between them. Biodiversity exists in a mosaic of habitats that we define based on the degree of human use, interference, and exploitation. Natural ecosystems such as forests, savannas, mountain slopes, and oceans numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this IPBES figure from the global assessment, as well as managed ecosystems such as rangelands, farms, towns, and modified coasts indicated by A, B, and C here, and the interconnections between them. These two types of ecosystems host different types of species, and they also respond differently to human drivers. The proximity and interconnections between natural and managed ecosystems can influence their respective dimensions of biodiversity. In addition, the indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as people with long history of integration with nature, can make large contributions in conserving biodiversity, particularly in the managed ecosystems. For these reasons, the distinction between natural and managed ecosystems needs to be better reflected in the framework, and we suggest actually extending milestone A1 to include managed ecosystems and their integrity. Next slide, please. So importantly, all dimensions of biodiversity are interlinked, and we have shown and we have indications that interlinked response, they do respond in an interlinked way to human drivers. The dimensions of biodiversity include from the bottom genes, species, populations, communities, and all the way up to ecosystems. Any action on a driver of biodiversity loss with the aim of improving one dimension of biodiversity can have ripple effects across other dimensions of biodiversity. For example, an action that aims to maintain species populations will also contribute to the maintenance of genetic diversity of that species population. It will reduce the species extinction rate and also at the same time provide ecosystems with greater resistance to disease, pest outbreaks, and even provide more resilient ecosystem services. The interlinkages among dimensions of biodiversity underlie the many-to-many relationships that David was showing in his earlier targets and to any goal and milestone. So our knowledge of the interlinkages between the different dimensions of biodiversity should help us guide conservation efforts and help with the formulation of the quantitative elements in the framework's targets, milestones, and goals. And now I'll pass over to Lynn.
Thanks, Katie. So we're on to our last three findings. Finding 7, immediate and sustained action to ensure recovery. So time lags depend on the driver and on the ecosystem, and they exist because different ecological and evolutionary processes underpin the responses of biodiversity to the different pressures. There's good evidence that while some dimensions of biodiversity recover rapidly following conservation action, many show long-lasting or time-delayed outcomes. And these can be shortened if action is implemented immediately to reduce the effect of the drivers on our biodiversity loss and to restore ecosystems. So all in all, ambitious action is needed immediately, and it must be sustained over time so that we will then be able to put biodiversity onto a recovering trend by 2050. Importantly, immediate action will also lower the cumulative loss of biodiversity, and it will shorten the time that we need for recovery. Next slide, please. Thanks, Adrian. So finding 8 is to coordinate across scales. The degree of biodiversity change and the relative importance of the drivers varies greatly across scales and from place to place. And drivers in one place can affect the biodiversity in a distant place. It thus follows that responsibilities of countries vary with biodiversity that they host, as well as the remote biodiversity that they affect by their actions. And therefore we need to really establish mechanisms that account for global biodiversity responsibilities and response capacities to ensure that there's fair sharing of conservation burden among countries. So each country might need to prioritize the set of targets and actions that are more critical for their contribution to achieve the global goals. So in short, international collaboration should be strengthened and should be more focused than it currently is in terms of how to adequately and equitably share the effects of our mitigation of drivers and of reversing biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. So our last, our final finding for today, invest in monitoring. Indicators are needed not only to assess the progress that we make towards goals and targets, but also to inform the strategic planning of our outcomes to enable us to effectively and efficiently achieve the outcomes that we are desiring. Current biodiversity indicators achieve the detection of trends fairly well, but they really are attributed to possible drivers. And here I'll point you in the cyclical diagram on the screen to the second on the left there. Explanatory modeling or attribution of the links between actions and drivers and biodiversity is really needed. So a detection and attribution framework for biodiversity is needed to establish where and to what extent the drivers are causing the biodiversity change that we observe or that we will observe. And this would facilitate our planning and prioritization of interventions, and it would guide our actions to achieve the 2030 milestones and the 2020 goals. And now I'm going to pass over to Paul, I think. Cornelia. Andy, I'm passing over to Andy.
Thank you, Lynn. So allow me to summarize these findings that you've heard today with the 8 key messages we give in the information document. So the first of these that you see in the center of the circle there is transformative change. The body of evidence that our experts reviewed shows that halting biodiversity loss by 2030 and reversing biodiversity loss by 2050 is going to require transformative change in all sectors of society. Achieving ambitious targets for conservation is going to require expanding and investing in our protected areas, in species management plans and restoration. I mean, these are vital components of an integrated set of policies and solutions, but nature positive outcomes for biodiversity are going to arise if we achieve transformative change on all indirect drivers. Key message 2 that you see at the top there is that we must act on all drivers. We saw from the flow diagram that David presented that achieving ambitious objectives for biodiversity in Goal A is going to require a comprehensive set of actions to reduce all direct threats to biodiversity. Those include land and sea use change, climate change, direct exploitation of species and organisms, pollution, invasive alien species. But what's key is that these drivers, these direct drivers, are interacting, and they're interacting at different scales. So by acting on multiple drivers simultaneously, we can make progress on mitigating their impacts and indeed reversing those impacts. Key message 3 was acting across levels. Global targets of the GBF provide an important template for action, but it's how these targets are implemented and how these actions are coordinated across local, national, and international levels that will determine our success in achieving our objectives for biodiversity. It's the coordinating, adapting, and iterating our actions across levels that will likely result in positive outcomes. Key message 4 is including managed ecosystems. Reversing biodiversity loss will require that we address threats to biodiversity in both natural and managed ecosystems, and also thinking about the interconnections between those 2 broad classes of ecosystems. They differ in their biodiversity, they differ in their ecosystem functions, and the many benefits that we receive from those ecosystems. So we must target our actions and the indicators and the monitoring requirements that we need for biodiversity in managed ecosystems so that we can encompass these differences and do a good job in both locations. Key message 5 is acting on all dimensions of biodiversity, from genetic up to the ecosystem. All of these levels show interlinked responses to human drivers, Our efforts to mitigate the effects of drivers on one dimension, such as genetic diversity, can have cascading positive outcomes for other dimensions, such as population abundances and mitigating extinction rates. So it's the knowledge of these interlinked relationships between the dimensions of biodiversity that can be used to guide prioritization for conservation. Message 6 was on time lags. There is good evidence that for a while, some dimensions of biodiversity will recover rapidly following conservation action. Many will show long-lasting responses of patterns of recovery, sometimes in the order of decades. So we have to act soon, and we have to sustain that action. And if we do so, then there is a hope then, and there's an expectation that we can put ourselves on a trend to recovery by mid-century or 2050. Key message 7 is about accounting for distant impacts. The global nature of our economy means that biodiversity loss may be driven by demand in faraway places, often in other continents. So international collaboration could focus on how to address these geographic disparities and the impacts that they have on ecosystems and nature's contributions to people. And our last key message is on monitoring. Successful implementation of the GBF will require substantial investment in our capacity to monitor biodiversity, the different dimensions of biodiversity, and crucially, the drivers. We are not monitoring the drivers in a systematic fashion, and we need this to guide action. There is a need also to ensure that the supply of and access to data that underpin the effective use of indicators that track progress, but also guide proactive action at different spatial scales and at different levels of policy and action. So this brings me to the end of our presentation. Thank you to the Secretary for the CBD for hosting this webinar. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to answering your questions. And please feel free to add those questions to the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And yes, we should have mentioned at the beginning, on this platform, the way that the platform works is that we sort of define speakers. So I won't be able to hand the floor over to anyone who's wishing to ask a question, but if you type your questions into the chat, they'll show up on our side, and then we will make sure that we direct them to the appropriate people. And so anyway, so I'm sure questions will start coming in now that we've made that clear, and I apologize for that. So I think that there is a simple question here in the chat that we can go to first, which is someone is asking if this assessment included below ground species in addition to the sort of different spheres that you had mentioned. And I think, Katie, this was on your slide in terms of looking at the scope of biodiversity included in the report. Thanks. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I was muted. The question was about the different scales?
If below ground species were included.
That's a really good question. We did not specifically address the below ground species. They are vital to ecosystem functioning and the degradation and cycling of materials. But no, it's not included in our assessment, but of course it is part of the solution for all aspects of biodiversity. I mean, it includes species and ecosystem functioning as well. But if anyone on the panel would also like to contribute to the question, feel free.
Yes, just to reinforce that point, actually, the work we did on time lags and recovery clearly demonstrated the beginnings of the evidence that we can see now on how important it is to restore and protect our soils. They're an important part of the recovery process in many ecosystems. And the more we degrade ecosystems, the more we degrade our soils, the longer it takes to recover arthropod biodiversity, for example, microarthropod biodiversity, which is so important to rates of decomposition and the lags that we see in those processes in ecosystems.
Thank you. So the next question that I'm seeing is someone is asking how the link between biodiversity and infectious disease is being included in this assessment. I'm not sure who the best person to answer this question is. Thanks.
I think we can just say
Paul?
that
Yeah.
it's not one of the things that we looked at in this particular one. We know that, especially with the current pandemic, that's a really important issue, but it's not one that we addressed in our report.
So I think, Paul, this question may also be best addressed to you. And I'm just going to read this one directly. And so this person has expressed their concern on your constant use of the term transformative change, but have you provided criteria on how that may be achieved? Thanks.
So we've analyzed a number of specific scenarios that include what we would think of as transformative change. And those do include very explicit things like changes in waste of food, overconsumption of food. So a couple of these sustainability scenarios specifically included, for example, the Eat Lancet diet as one example. There have been a number of work on scenarios that have specifically looked at the role of subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity. So we do know some specific elements of what transformative change is. The best place to go if you're interested in transformative change, of course, is the IPBES assessment, global assessment, which spent a fair amount of time looking at that. And of course, in the future, there will be the transformative change assessment of IPBES that'll be coming out in a couple of years. But yes, there are a number of key elements of transformative change that are important, and we list some of the key ones even in the executive summary.
Thank you, Paul. So Andy, I'm going to ask you the next question, which is maybe a little bit tricky to answer on the spot, but someone is saying in the paper, so maybe not in the presentation, but in the paper, there is a recommendation to improve the indicators for measuring the integrity of managed ecosystems, separate from natural ecosystem integrity. And they were wondering if you had suggestions, I think, on how this could be done and what the headline indicator might be for this.
Maybe, sorry, Julia, maybe I can jump in on that one because
yeah,
I just had a very recent conversation on this. So there are a number of ways to try and address integrity in managed ecosystems. What I think is really important is that many of the measures of integrity that have been developed for natural systems are not well adapted to managed ecosystems. So things like what we call the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is typically used to measure the naturalness of ecosystems, is not particularly good for managed ecosystems. There's been a very recent effort to develop what's called the Functional Integrity Index, and there'll be a number of papers coming out on that very soon. And that is an index that provides information not only about biodiversity, but also the functional diversity, functional integrity of managed ecosystems in landscapes. So it's not, and seascapes. So it's not just focusing on managed ecosystems per se. So that would be one possible kind of measure, this functional integrity index that actually could be applied. And that group has shown actually how that could be applied both at national scales and international scales. And maybe Andy, you want to add to that?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I would add to that one concrete example is working on the connectivity of these landscapes. So this is the integrity from the point of view of the movement of organisms, the flows of genes, and the transfer of ecosystem elements, and thinking about how we can manage for connectivity. That is restoring the connectivity of not only remnant natural ecosystems within managed ecosystems, but thinking about the subsidies and the connectivity between or among ecosystem types, whether that's forest to wetlands or grasslands to wetlands. And so some of the integrated measures, for example, that I'm involved in Canada is thinking about, okay, we need a separate target for connectivity in managed ecosystems because they're so fragmented. Remnant patches in managed ecosystems are so fragmented that to restore connectivity there requires a separate target and a concerted action to do that. So that would be one concrete action that we know how to do, and we know how to do at multiple levels of governance, if you like.
Thank you. So now I'm going to hand over to David, I think, and this is asking if you considered the limitation of the current tools when analyzing the 3 different scenarios. This person is expressing that they're concerned that innovations in scientific research's role are underestimated when talking about transformative change, and so maybe you could give, or someone could give some background on the limitation of the different analysis.
I can give a short answer, and then perhaps Paul may want to add as he compiled that together. But yes, so what we did was a compilation of the science, of what's out there in the published literature and additional knowledge, particularly since the IPBES global assessment and the GBO5 came out. So this was not a novel research activity, and I think that's very important in terms of synthesizing science for the GBF process. And also in terms of transformative change, we are more biodiversity based as opposed to the social part of doing that work. But there's a lot of work coming up. Under IPBES, there's a nexus assessment and transformative change assessments. They're just starting right now to run for the next 3 years, and we'll provide a lot of new information on that.
So maybe what I could add to that is a lot of the scenarios work does make some very specific assumptions about the kinds of technical and technological changes that could happen. So in particular, within agriculture, almost all of them assume that we can close yield gaps in a major way and actually increase yield even in countries where you're near the very maximum amount of yield that you could expect from crops. And that's making a really big, incredibly positive assumption about how much technical and technological changes we can make in agricultural systems. They also assume that there are changes in production of energy, things like that. They do not, in general, assume any major technological leaps. So fusion does not all of a sudden magically appear at 2035 and make energy freely available worldwide. So yeah, there could be some breakthroughs that are made, technological breakthroughs that are made that are not accounted for in scenarios, but the scenarios are assuming that there are major technological and technical advances that are made.
Thank you. As I'm looking through the questions, there's a lot of questions, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. There are a number of questions related to the inclusion of managed ecosystems in general in the scope of A1, and how do we include managed ecosystems in a way that is sort of logical based on your analysis in the framework, given the interlinkages between natural and managed ecosystems, but also given some of the differences between these different types of ecosystems. So I think the question that's really being asked in a lot of different people's minds is, how could this better be addressed in the framework based on or from your perspective, based on the analysis that you have completed? Maybe, Paul, if you want to start this off and then hand over to anyone else that you see fit.
So I think that's a really important question. And you can see that throughout the global biodiversity framework that natural ecosystems really are in the forefront, even though managed ecosystems are addressed. So for example, in the target on sustainable agriculture and forestry, clearly that's addressing issues of sustainability in managed ecosystems. What you see less is in the milestones in particular. It does actually show up in the 2050 goal that there should be an increase in the integrity of managed ecosystems. And what we're suggesting is that especially in the milestones, especially for A1, but not only, that managed ecosystems should be more present. But it certainly was David Obura who sort of led the writing of the part on natural and managed ecosystems, and maybe he's better placed to address that.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just make a couple of comments here. And one is that With conservation very focused on natural ecosystems and places that are in more pristine, quote unquote, condition, what that tends to mean is we ignore places that are not in such good condition, and yet there is a lot of, one, there's a lot of biodiversity in those places, and two, there's a lot of people who depend on ecosystem services from that nature in those places for farming, fishing, water supply, and things like that. And there's a lot of emerging science now that maintaining natural or semi-natural habitats in those transformed places or shared landscapes and seascapes is increasingly important, not only for people, but also for sustaining biodiversity, for the connectivity between fragments of natural landscapes as well, as was mentioned already. Emerging guidance is that we need 20% of natural habitat in these altered spaces. And so incorporating these into the framework is going to be critical. I think it'll be very difficult to do it in a very quantitative way immediately. And I think having space within the monitoring and assessment framework to build up the indicators and build up the science so we can actually measure the contribution of these spaces to biodiversity conservation under multiple targets and for benefit sharing and use will be important as we move forward.
Maybe I could just add really briefly that in the 2050 goal, there is a goal to improve the integrity of managed ecosystems. And I think it is really important to keep in mind that the measures of integrity that have been designed for natural ecosystems are very poorly designed for measuring ecosystem integrity in managed ecosystems. And there has to be some real thought about how you're going to measure integrity in managed ecosystems.
And this is an important point for target 2 on restoration as well, because of course restoration is increasingly valuable where degradation is higher, and this will tend to be in managed ecosystems rather than just in natural ecosystems. And so the integration of the targets together, again, has to be very carefully considered in terms of planning effort under all of them and moving forward. Thanks.
And to this, I would just add that the distribution of impacts of different drivers are very different in managed and natural ecosystems. And because in general, we're not monitoring for drivers, using that information to iterate our approaches to restoring integrity in managed ecosystems is much harder. So I think if we can combine those efforts, we can better link monitoring at scale, focused on drivers, then we can take an adaptive approach to restoring integrity.
Okay, thank you. I think this sort of transitions to the next set of questions that I'm going to ask, and maybe I'll start with Alex on this. And in terms of trying to achieve transformative change, there's a number of comments related to the fact that there's going to be these time lags. And so we know that we are going to see a gaps in terms of being able to monitor progress. So how do we demonstrate progress in this with the time lags that are given? And in addition, you do stress the need for high ambition. I mean, I think this is throughout the paper. However, as you know, there's still sort of a gap in the information related to the specific numerical elements in the goals and targets. And so what advice do you have on sort of how can those numerical aspects of the goals and targets be better developed? Thanks.
So thanks, Gillian, and thanks everyone for all of the questions. I think when defining ambition, I think there are two important levels, 2 dimensions that are of course complementary, but there is the qualitative definition of ambition, is what do you include in it, and what do you focus on, what's the package, where you need to be good, so that you get the results you want. And then there's a question of the numbers for each of the elements in the package. And I think that especially in the scenario work that Paul presented, And as he was saying, there are certain aspects of the GBF discussions now that are receiving more momentum than others. And so my reply to you on this is that I think an important message from the synthesis is that qualitatively, what we're saying is that you need to have an ambition throughout the 21 action targets. And that for certain of them, especially those related to implementation, actually to take into account the timeline that we were mentioning. That's the first graph that was shown by David. You need to start there first, and those are the places where also there was the least progress in the last decade. So they're urgently needed. Then when it comes to setting, and I'll let the colleagues complete if they want to add more their own perspective, but of course, ideally, any work could cover more aspects, but when we were thinking about it initially, but then when we saw the amount of work that was necessary, I would say, to first cover the more qualitative aspect of ambition, to address that first, it was already enough effort, and then we didn't have time to cover all the other aspects.
If I could add two things there. One is that it's really important, and this is something that Andy was talking about, is that it's really important to be able to look at what implementation of the targets is actually doing. So we need to have a monitoring system so that we can look at what actually happens when we implement a target. Because of these lags, we need to know over time what's actually happening as we implement that. So it does get to the kind of idea that there already is for the climate convention, that there is a need to come back and review on a regular basis the ambition of the targets. The second one is that this difference in lags, of course, it means things need to be done now, but it also means that one of the interests of having the 2030 milestones and the 2050 goals is because of those lags, the ambition for the 2030 can't be as high as it is for 2050. And that's why it's really important to have an intermediate target to know if you're on the pathway to get to these longer term goals that are going to let you account for these multi-decadal kinds of lags that you have between when you implement these actions and when you actually get the results that you're hoping to get for biodiversity.
Thank you. So I think we're kind of coming closer to the end, and I want to address a few questions that I'm seeing in the chat myself, and others can chime in, and I'm going to flag this also for Basil for whenever he speaks, which is there's a few comments in the chat about the sort of format of this discussion now and how this information has come out. So as you are aware, the session today is really an information sharing session where we're hearing the results presented from the findings. But as you've noticed with GoTo, it's not really an open dialogue because of the fact that we only have certain people who are speaking, and so we can't sort of have this back and forth. And this is certainly a weakness in terms of the format of what we're doing today. However, we do have this time before now and the meetings in Geneva, and we have the meetings in Geneva. And so there are opportunities for including this dialogue, which I think is definitely what the people involved in this webinar today would like. And I think this is also something that is beneficial for the parties. And so I am just sort of flagging this for Basil when you conclude, to let us know what it is that would be most useful from the perspective of the open-ended working group, and how, you know, how do we make sure that dialogue is really maximized between the scientific community and the parties themselves. So with that, now I'm going to hand back over, and I'll switch, and then people can comment on this as they come in, to asking a question. And I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually ask this question to everyone, and maybe we can go through and have everyone provide their perspective on this before we then sort of conclude the webinar, which is really, and I mean, we can also perhaps have time for a bit more, but in the paper, you know, it does stress the need for quantification of targets and achieving high ambition. But what do you think? How do we actually sort of distill this document into providing very concrete advice? Or how would you distill this into providing very concrete advice to parties on how to use this to best formulate the targets? And perhaps also, you know, not just the targets, but perhaps also the monitoring framework, which we're going to be discussing on Thursday, and even, you know, how do we use this information, or how would you propose this information is used in the review mechanism in the future? Thanks. So, yeah, Lynn, I see that you're ready to go first.
Yeah, I just thought it would be important to reflect here, perhaps just to start answering it and then we can open it up, but just to reflect on the importance of us looking at responsibility and how that's distributed across countries. And I think if we start to look at that in terms of where the responsibility for certain actions is needed most to mitigate biodiversity loss on the different pressures, we really are then going to be able to be guided in terms of what can we formulate to put out there for countries to pick up on in terms of what they can actually contribute to. And we have to remember that we have countries that really have very, very few resources to actually go out and implement mitigation actions. And so we really need international collaboration there to support those countries in how they're going to be able to manage or act to prevent biodiversity loss. And often those are the countries that are not specifically the highest or most impactful countries, but their biodiversity is suffering the most. And so then we really are needing to assist. And so I think my main point, just to get this little bit of discussion going, is really that the importance of international collaboration, of working at the scale of kind of looking at regions and what they need, and then on the countries and the national targets, is going to be really challenging, but it's something we're going to have to face if we want to get anything further. And I'll leave it now because I'm sure the other panelists can hop in here.
Everyone's being very polite. I'll jump on that because I actually have a point that Lynn has perfectly set up. Actually, there's a tendency for when we do reviews like this to focus on the state of what's happening, and maybe less about how to harness this knowledge to prioritize action at different scales, and to think about how regions and countries can collaborate in the sense that Lynn was speaking to. And there is an entire body of science that we did not review here that is focused on prioritization, but also on action. So trajectories to implementing change using multiple criteria at the same time. So, for example, pathways for 30 by 2030, there was a recent analysis by the World Bank that took into account the best biodiversity data, but then used global economic models to figure out, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses for different sectors of the economy. So when you put these things together, we can find various scenarios where outcomes lead to sort of win-win outcomes for different regions. And then at more local scales, we can then iterate these prioritization. And then, as was suggested by Paul earlier, we can trend to these milestones in a way that is using the best science, the best data to integrate our actions. So for me, it's really, it's leaving you with a message that we do know how to do that, and maybe this is a role for research synthesis centers in different regions to support countries in that plan.
Thank you. Does anyone else want? Yeah, Paul.
Sure. So I think there are a number of broad recommendations and then some more specific recommendations. So again, the broad recommendation, a couple of broad recommendations. So at the Substa last year in May and June, a number of parties raised the question, do we really need quantitative milestones and quantitative goals, milestones for 2030 and quantitative goals for 2050? And I think what we've shown both through the scenarios that we're looking at and this analysis of lags, that it's really important to have an intermediate time period where you have very clear and, if at all possible, quantitative objectives for 2030, so that you know or not if you're on your pathway to your 2050 goals. So I think our report really emphasizes the need to maintain ambitious and quantitative milestones. The second thing is that, again, and this is a very broad one without providing specific information on the quantitative elements of any specific target, it's clearly saying that targets, for example, like the target on subsidies, that there's a real important need to maintain high ambition and, if at all possible, quantitative components for those targets. There is currently a very ambitious quantitative target there. So we're not suggesting that it should be even more ambitious than that, just that those things that are in these about indirect drivers, it's really important that they stay ambitious and, if at all possible, quantitative. And then we have some very specific recommendations. One of these specific recommendations has to do with taking into account managed ecosystems. There is a real need to better account for managed ecosystems in the global biodiversity framework, and it will, with difficulty, meet its objectives if they're not better accounted for. There are also a number of other things that we treat a little bit, perhaps not as high-level messages, but I think that are also really important for discussions on the global biodiversity framework. So in the section that David led about natural and managed ecosystems, one of the things that we said is that there's what we talk about is the difference between degraded ecosystems, managed ecosystems, and converged ecosystems. And that's very important for target 2 in terms of the discussions around restoration. So a recent paper that was used to help support that target on restoration actually is talking about restoring converted ecosystems, many of which are actually managed ecosystems and would not be considered degraded ecosystems by many people. So there's a big difference between a managed system, which might be considered a converted system, and degraded ecosystem. So there's a number of other messages that are sort of lower level in our report that are also extremely important in terms of the discussions in the global biodiversity framework.
I think this brings me to another question that I'm seeing in the chat, and one that I think a lot of people are probably grappling with, which follows nicely from what you just said, Paul, so I'll hand it back to you, which is, in addition to trying to navigate this discussion on the global biodiversity framework, do you have any recommendations on how this can actually be used to create national level targets, particularly in terms of this sharing the burden idea, as it's unlikely that every country would contribute to every single target in the same way. So how can the framework be designed in such a way that the aggregate commitment or the aggregate targets of countries would actually result in the achievement of the global biodiversity framework?
That's an excellent question. And it's one that I think everyone realizes that in the discussions around the Global Biodiversity Framework. Just as an example, that it's maybe a little bit of beating a dead horse, but the protected areas quantitative element of 30%, you can either implement that in 30% in every country, or you can allocate that in ways that would actually be optimal, in which case some countries would have much greater burden than others. And there is currently no mechanism in the discussions of the Global Biodiversity Framework to actually treat that in an explicit way. One of the ways to deal with that would be to call on the scientific community to help actually provide information that could lead to a better implementation of that. So there is a lot of knowledge about the best ways to allocate protected areas, for example, that could actually inform any discussion that there would be internationally of the best way to allocate the burden of protected areas. And that's also true in terms of restoration. That's also true in terms of pollution and many other things. Just as an example, the burden of fertilizer pollution is an example that Alex really likes to give, is that clearly there are some countries in which there are really excess fertilizer that's being used in agricultural systems, and that's having really negative impacts on biodiversity. And there are other countries where there's not actually enough fertilizer being put on, and crops are actually mining the nutrients out of the soil and impoverishing soils, and they could actually use more fertilizer. And so if you apply the target on nutrient pollution uniformly globally, that actually could have negative effects on both on the ecosystem services and on biodiversity. And there's a lot of scientific knowledge on the best way to allocate that burden internationally. So just to, maybe that's making a plug for the scientific community, but I do think that there's a lot that the scientific community could bring to the table to those discussions about allocation of national burden.
Yes, Lynn.
Yeah, maybe also just if we look at some of the indirect drivers and how those are distributed, and we look at where the ecosystem services are most used and which aspects are, and trace that back. I think that's also an important aspect, and there has been research on that, and we need to really draw in, as we were saying, we really need to draw in the experts on that. So it's really tracking things at a slightly different level to what we normally look at. But if we're looking at some of the indirect drivers in particular, that's going to inform us. And those are not, as somebody said earlier in the presentation, those are not uniformly distributed at all. So the effects are not, and the actions are not, neither are the drivers.
Yeah, if I may, so if I comment on this as well, Gillian, just to add, and I think this is something that we've tried to do in the report, is to focus on the integrative nature of this issue and the balance across the targets, rather than focusing on the specific quantitative levels within any individual target, because there are focused, scientific recommendations and communities around those. I think the one thing we've tried to emphasize is that there are differential roles among countries and actors, from global to national and even to local levels. And this can relate to, of course, where biodiversity is or what biodiversity is has been the focus in the conservation community. We've tried to shine a really strong light on the drivers of biodiversity decline, because unless we address those, the actions taken for conservation in particular areas will be undermined by those drivers increasing. And so the critical support for that is moving the monitoring framework as well beyond just the biodiversity measures for outcomes, but also to monitoring those drivers, because we need to see changes in those drivers before we'll see changes in the outcomes in biodiversity. So we need to bend the curve on drivers before we're going to see a bending of the curve of biodiversity loss. And I think getting that into the discussion we need the cooperation amongst countries and actors to really understand what needs to be done, where actions need to be taken, and how responsibility is allocated. And the science and monitoring can help with that process.
So I think we're reaching the end of the webinar, unfortunately. And so I want to point out to those of you who didn't get your questions answered, I do apologize. I will just say, there are additional questions in the chat related to Indigenous people, related to pollution and different types of pollution, related to interactions between land, water, and oceans, and focusing in on some of the importance of these different ecosystems and the interactions between them. And there's some other questions related to definitions in general. So I apologize, there are certainly questions that we're not going to have time for. And I think that this is a good point then to hand over to the co-chairs of the Working Group 2020, or the Open-Ended Working Group. And perhaps, Basil, as you are concluding, you could also reflect on how do we make sure that we increasingly have such a dialogue so that we don't end up with just a long list of unanswered questions.
Thank you, Gillian. And Francis is also online, so I will start and maybe he can be given the floor to add to the remarks. First, I want to thank you, Paul, Andy, Lynn, Kathy, and David, and the 45 others. You've been volunteering your time. This shows that you care about what we're doing, and I'm very, very impressed by the amount of work you put into that and the level of efforts. This is something you sought on your own. You were not contacted by us. You were not contracted by the CBD or anybody to do that. That's a volunteer type of work. Now turning to parties and to the audience. You will remember, if we go back to 2018 and the 14 principles that you gave us for the preparation of the GBF, one of those is to be science-based. Science-based can mean many things, but here we are. We have the science community from a very wide perspective that is sending us a message. What I see in the very high level of participation here is that you are listening to science. And I see also in the question that there is some really good questioning and engagement in trying to understand what's the message, and very much in terms of how do we translate that advice into improving our GBF. We're gonna get together in March and have those conversations. And between now and March, I'm sure there will be a lot of bilateral discussion, regional groups, national groups, and I'm sure all those groups will be taking into consideration the key points that was given by this group. I was gonna go back through all those points, but I think both the presenters and discussion make me think that it is not necessary to go back through them. And as some of you have said in the question, at one point or the other, all of those are one way or the other has been part of the discussion. The difference now is we get the science backing in behind those, and we get this elaboration and articulation of those points. And that's very important to us, and we should listen to that very carefully. No doubts that, like me, you look at that and you're thinking we're thinking that the task is daunting. Transformative change is not easy. Transformative change is something that is very, very difficult. That's as most of you know, I'm not particularly fond of the terminology. I like to talk about big system change, but that doesn't matter. It's just a word. What we need to think about is transmit the message to our political masters that if we are serious about addressing that challenge that we got in front of us, if we're serious about realizing the potential of progress in socioeconomic development, we have to invest in those change. And actually, it makes sense to do so. It makes sense in terms of avoidance of cost, but also it makes sense in terms of socioeconomic development. So we should welcome this independent call. I think it's important. It's an important juncture in our discussion as we're set to go back into the negotiation. This should be a background, a document that we should consider carefully. Now, the next question is what's going to come up next? And clearly, there is kind of the short-term consideration. Gillian has talked about the questions, and I think it's very interesting to look at the question as a whole, what was asked, what was not asked. But also, it is also important to see how we're going to be able to continue this dialogue. I noticed a very clear desire to get further work done on the numerical aspect of the targets by several of you in the question target. That is something that's maybe would be useful. How do we get that done? I am totally reluctant to ask more work from Paul, Andy, and company, but I would be delighted if they could do so. And then second, I think we're going to need to think, how do we shape our relationship with science? Are we going to wait for a kind of every second year kind of coming to the mountains and hearing people? And I get this image of all of you handling stone tablets to us, but that's not what it is. But or do we want to have a relationship that is more ongoing and back and forth as we go forward? Especially as we are moving into the implementation in the next few months. How do we establish the relationship at the regional and national levels? I think Andy has been talking about that. So those are big questions we're going to need to think about. Once again, let's have a very careful and detailed look at this work. Let's work together to see how we can get to a better GBF. One that is ambitious in terms of reaching our vision, but also realistic. So I will stop there and see if Francis is able to take the floor and add to this. Thank you.
I am not sure, Francis. I actually don't see Francis in the list of presenters. I don't know if you can hear me, Francis. I believe you would have had to use a special link in order to speak. So if you didn't click on the link, then it's going to be difficult for us to give you the floor. Maybe we wait just a second to see if he can change over, or if the IT team can change him. I don't know. Okay, so I think no. I think, Francis, I apologize. I believe that you're stuck in this situation where you're not able to speak.
I'm there now.
Ah, yeah, now you're here. Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. It's always good to be a little patient and to work. So good day to you all. And I think my colleague Basil has already said quite a lot on what our views, our understanding of science in the post-2020 is. Transformative change. We've had a lot of views being expressed, and I think it is how this term can be made much more simpler for people to understand what it is. I see that we are now talking about transformative action. Perhaps from there is when we are going to move into transformative change. So these are some of the things that clarity will be further needed. Then when we talk about also involvement of the scientific community, if you look at, and my colleague has referred to COP decision 1434, but if you look at paragraph 6 of that decision, specifically calls for the scientific community to actively engage and contribute to the process for the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So I think you are contributing to that, which the COP did say the scientific community can. Something I also want to say is that I think what you've done, and I would like to thank you, Geoborn Biodiscovery, is to try to begin unlocking how science is going to play a role in the post-2020, because we might say science has a role to play, science has a role to play, but are people even trying to understand what it is in practice? But also I think we need to see how we link science to traditional knowledge. I think it is in some places it might be very difficult to just go scientific science by its own without getting some or leverage from traditional knowledge as well. Now, something as I come to the conclusion of my remarks is I would like to touch a little bit on the natural ecosystem versus the managed ecosystems. Now, this is also another area that we constantly will need to be really trying to understand what they mean in different situations. If we say natural and managed ecosystem, natural and managed ecosystem, in some places, natural ecosystems are also managed ecosystems. Managed ecosystems are also natural ecosystems. What am I saying there? You find a wildlife protected area, a forest reserve, it is under management by a certain authority. So it is also being managed. But then you find that in some cases, there are areas that are outside protected areas. Those are the ones that you say its management in most cases is not very clear, because there are either farming systems or other, the rangelands you are talking about, or other uses. So you're talking of really natural ecosystems that are either under management, and then those natural ecosystems that are outside protected area systems that are under other systems of management. So these are things that I'm now just looking at the perspective of my country here, that can it be clear to most people if we put it that way? Will they not confuse it? Because if natural ecosystem and managed ecosystems are being looked at differently, what is it going to mean to people? And yet, natural ecosystems can be managed. There are different authorities given to manage that, but also there are those other areas outside the protected area system that are now under management. So when you talk about management, it will cut across, whether natural or not. And our management, this we could understand and are able to clearly discern the difference between those two. And I think that is why goal A, you may not see still managed ecosystems in there. And some of those could be the issues that the link between those two, depending on the context, could mean there's one and the same thing, really. So that is just what I needed to add there. And thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you for continuing to be with us in this process. I see that we're about 221 who attended. And I think it's good to keep the momentum going now that we are almost certain that the meeting in March is there. So it's good that we keep this momentum going. Thank you so much.
So on behalf of the Secretariat, I would also like to thank everyone for joining. I would like to thank everyone who presented today, and the SAPSTA chair and the co-chairs for providing some thoughts. And everything will be available on the website for this for this meeting, so you can find the presentation there, and a video if you would like to go back. And of course, we'll have an additional session this evening if you're super keen. And then I also wanted to quickly mention that on Thursday we will have a webinar on the monitoring framework, which of course is linked to this and is also under the same SAPSTA agenda item. So with that, again, thank you very much, and we will see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.